nuclear war. That was the fear. That was the time where everybody was building bomb shelters. You had practices in school where you got under your desk. I don't know if that would really do much good in a nuclear attack.
The Cuban Missile Crisis was the closest the world has ever knowingly come to a third world war. Sensing a rising threat from the Soviets following the end of the Second World War, Canada focused on forming alliances, primarily with its neighbor, the United States. In 1949, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was formed. It stated that an armed attack against a NATO member would be considered an attack against them all.
We'd just come out of several years of horrific warfare, devastating losses on all sides. NATO was the Allied forces sort of working together.
NATO was sort of an exclusive club of the North Atlantic, and it was to have everybody sort of a collective defense against the Russian bear.
NATO's focus quickly went from being a peacetime military alliance to a frontline deterrent of the Soviet Union. And hunting for submarines became a key component of Canada's defense plans in anti-submarine warfare, or ASW.
We had to always be on the lookout for submarines and to see that they didn't come in closer so that they could attack any strategic targets. It wasn't necessarily to destroy them, it was to sort of scare them off, deter them, keep them out of our backyard.
By the end of the 1950s, tensions had escalated further, and Canada received disturbing intelligence that the Soviets had the technology to launch nuclear-armed missiles from conventional submarines capable of reaching Canadian soil. In 1961, the U.S. tried and failed to overthrow communist Cuban Premier Fidel Castro. Castro and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev reached a secret agreement to place Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba to deter future invasion attempts by the U.S. After this was discovered in October 1962, a tense standoff followed, with the world on the brink of potential nuclear war, now known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. And Canada took on the daunting task of monitoring much of the East Coast.
The tension was incredible. There was no one knew what was going to happen. Was it going to erupt into war, which was a very, very real threat at that time?
The Royal Canadian Navy took a major frontline role in anti-submarine warfare during the crisis, working with the U.S. Navy to patrol and monitor the North Atlantic Ocean for Soviet vessel activity, particularly submarines. Able seaman Mike Wenzel spent his first 5 years with the Navy on similar patrols.
I didn't know actually until I got on my first ship, and that's when I found out what the threat was. Russian submarines and fishing boats came over here and did their fishing, and our job was to go up and we called it checker stations. You'd go up and you'd sail out for 2 weeks or a month at a time and just go around the islands and keep an eye on them.
Before the missile crisis began, Canada's main focus was on the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap, a section of the Atlantic used as a thoroughfare that puts ocean traffic right off the coast of Newfoundland. It was assumed that most Soviet ships and submarines were likely to travel through this gap. But how do you hunt for submarines hidden in the icy depths of the Atlantic? The solution was the sound surveillance system, known as SOSUS, a groundbreaking underwater surveillance technology developed by the U.S. Navy in the early 1950s. SOSUS was a network of hydrophones mounted on the ocean floor that could detect submarines from long distances. The top secret work of tracking, analyzing, and reporting submarine movements fell in large part to a specialized team of women in the Royal Canadian Navy known as Wrens. Able Wren Gwen McDerby was part of this team.
And the work we did, we were on duty 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. There was always someone watching.
Able Wren McDerby and her team were stationed at HMCS Shelburne, the first SOSUS station under Canadian command. It was there that the cable from the hydrophone was connected.
There was a large room which had banks and banks of equipment which had these what were called leuphograms. It was a machine where there was thermal paper on the machine, and there was a stylus that went back and forth, and that stylus got the impulses from the sounds from the hydrophones, and it printed images. If we saw a single straight line, and it was down around the 21 decibel mark, that was indication that that was a nuclear submarine.
If an enemy submarine was identified, the ASW force, consisting of ships, planes, and helicopters, was instructed to act quickly before the Soviet ships could launch their deadly payloads.
We'd notify the chain of command, and they would notify the naval air and the ships, and they would send people out to see what they could see.
On October 22, 1962, U.S. President Kennedy announced a naval quarantine on Cuba. As reports came in of Soviet submarines in the quarantine zone, Canadian Prime Minister John Diefenbaker finally alerted forces on October 24th to be in a state of readiness. All available ships prepared for war and sailed out to meet the Soviet fleet. Able seaman Mike Wenzel was weeks away from retiring when the crisis began.
My chief said, you might as well sign on because you're not getting out anyway. And I went, what do you mean? He said, well, you know, this Cuban thing, they might have to go to war.
By the end of October, tensions began to ease as the crisis wound down with the help of United Nations diplomats. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev agreed to remove the Soviet missiles in return for Kennedy's promise not to invade Cuba. By early November, the crisis was all but over, though some missiles remained in Cuba. Canadian forces continued operations off the eastern seaboard for most of November.
I don't think we'll ever really know what went on in these really high-level meetings and so on that brought us back from the brink, so to speak, but just everybody was glad that they did.
The Cold War lasted for decades. During this time, Canada earned a worldwide reputation for excellence in anti-submarine warfare, and the Wrens provided invaluable support in watching over our Atlantic waters and keeping our borders safe, despite a lack of recognition for their contributions.
We couldn't talk to anybody about what we were doing. My parents never knew what I was doing. We worked in anonymity. People didn't know, there wasn't mention in history books, you know, so we were a hidden factor. But the job we did was very, very important. Even though there wasn't any physical war, so to speak of, we swore our allegiance to the country, and we were willing, if need be, to give our life for that.